Okay, brilliant. Game designers are all on steroids. You all are, and you're addicted to progression, and I want to speak about that and how to quit. I've written an article, it's up on my website, an old dev blog, but I figured I'd do a presentation as well because it's quite a lengthy article, and this is something I want to talk about, and obviously it's easier if people have actually processed the whole thing, so I figured it would be nice just to do a quick presentation to go along with the article. Okay, so what am I talking about? So game designers are on steroids. It's a problem we have across the industry. I would say AAA has it worse than anyone, but it's something that even indies suffer on. And it's this addiction to progression and escalation. And it's not always a bad thing, much like steroids aren't always a bad thing, but in most cases I would say it is a bad thing, and I would say we're over dependent on it. And as I say, the full article link is there. So as game designers, we're often playing with human psychology and tapping into the various triggers and tics of human behavior. Our reasons are varied. We're flirting with the player. Some of us want to give the player a roller coaster ride they can truly experience, to make them feel, to make them pay, to get our message burned across their heart. But almost all of us want them to keep on playing, because that's what we do. We make games that can be played. Now, I hate to say it, but you're hiding your shitty design behind progression, and this is all too common. So what am I talking about? Progression feels good. It is the cake, it is the icing, it is the sugar. Progression, like most drugs, it just feels really good. That's the thing people don't tell you. Progression is juicy. It fuels the way we do things. It's like a strong sauce or sugar that we like to hide behind. So if a game lacks a sense of flow, if we can't find a reason for a player to do something, we'll often tie some kind of progression to it, or we'll often raise the bar if we're not quite sure what to do with our core game loop. We'll say, okay, we will change the monster's color, we'll make the explosions go up bigger, we'll give you a bigger gun, we'll just up the ante. If the moment-to-moment play isn't satisfying for the player, if the player doesn't want to do that pointless minigame, if the player is sick of fighting the same old battles and they're doing it only to unlock something or only to progress further in your game, then you've probably failed as a designer. Now there is a valid use case I want to speak about, which I'll call the fixed narrative. This is largely a subject we've invented for this discussion, two artificial distinctions. So a fixed narrative is, it's got a bit of a blurred line, but I'm going to say for the purposes of our discussion that it's an authored narrative experience. It's short enough that most players are going to see the ending. Two good examples of this are Gone Home and the Call of Duty campaign. Most players who play those games will see the end of the campaign, and it's designed with that in mind. So the pacing and the escalation in the story, the moments of spectacle, are critically limited tools that are applied with editorial precision to give structure to the author's story and to give a climax, to give us something to go, woohoo, we're there. And like medical steroids, this is a valid use. You know, we always give people these things as a short-term thing. We never seek to give people dependency on this. We don't want people addicted to the progression for the sake of progression. We want to use progression to pull them through our story to that moment, that payoff. And that's really what a fixed narrative is in this definition. So this is a bit controversial, but you're selling content. At the end of the day, you know, if you're doing a fixed narrative, you're not so much interested in your core game loop as your content. And to that end, I say that every challenge in the game should be skippable. And I know that's slightly controversial, but I would point to Grand Theft Auto 5, which is a recent example of doing it right, where the people behind that game, they clearly had a story arc they wanted you to go through. They wanted you to see how those characters moved forward, and they wanted you to see the final payoff moment of that story. And to that end, they allowed pretty much every mission in that game to be skipped if you failed it a few times. I would say if the only valid action on the player failing something is that you restart that section or you freeze the narrative, then you're only frustrating the player, and you should let them skip past this. It's not the challenge you're selling the content. So the other side of the equation, if it's not fixed narrative, it's free play. I know this is kind of black and white, but it's for the purpose of the discussion. We're going to slice everything in two so we can talk about it. So some examples of this: chess, Spelunky, Starcraft multiplayer, Carcassonne. Every session starts on a level footing. You know, both players, they might be different. Like, for instance, if you're playing Frozen Synapse, the balance is asymmetric, so the players might not be at the same place. But it's a self-contained game loop with no acknowledgement of previous time spent playing. So your 1000th time through is the same as your first. And generally, as play session can be completed in a single session. It's a self-contained system fueled by the game loop. There's no grind or progression, or if there is progression, it's within the game loop. So the many excuses of the addict. Okay, this is going to be a bit fun. We all want the player to see the content they're paid for. Well, I say great. Hooray, hurrah to the player. We want to give them value. And if you're delivering a fixed narrative, if you're delivering a story, then give them the option to skip, as we said before. We don't want to say, you don't get to see the end because you're not good enough. If you're a skill-based game, then you invalidate the skill by allowing the player to skip, or by taking meaning away from the challenge. If you give them a more powerful sword eventually to defeat this boss because they've tried so many times to defeat this boss, then defeating this boss isn't a challenge, isn't a skill, it isn't something they have overcome. It is purely content that you've put there that you wanted to last a certain period of time. So you need to decide what your focus is, selling the content or selling a very strong game loop that can engage the player and have them returning for more content. The other example is we need to teach the player. I can't just give the player all the candy or all the tools and have them understand what to do with them. To this, I would say, if you're a narrative-based game, you probably only require basic instruction and guidance. If you're playing something that is, QTE driven, or if you're playing something that is narrative focused, really the mechanics should be simple enough to pick up that they don't impede the storytelling. You're not trying to get this person to be really good at first-person shooters. You're trying to use the genre of first-person shooters to get across the story, this experience. And yes, there has to be some challenge there and such, but it's purely textual and it's skippable, as we said before. And now if you're doing a challenge-driven game, I'd say, well, don't do a tutorial. Rather do an onboarding experience that you can do as a separate mode or as a skippable element. A good example of this is if you're teaching someone Go, you start on a small board to teach them Go. Or with Starcraft multiplayer, because they acknowledge it's totally different from single player, you're taught the skills you needed for multiplayer through a set of challenges that you can perform aside from multiplayer. And if you give the player all the mechanics from the start, that doesn't mean they have to use all the mechanics from the start. You can give them all the tools and you can introduce them to a few and let them discover the other elements. Have some faith in your player that they will investigate and find the depth in your game. So we want to acknowledge the player's effort. This is probably the most dangerous and hardest to invalidate excuse. If you reward effort rather than success, you are training people not to succeed. Worse, you're crippling them for the real challenges that life will throw at them. Games are as much about enriching the player as they are entertaining them. We are ultimately there for the betterment of the player in some way, whether that is just to tune out and have fun, or whether that's to give them something they can look back on or share with their friends or whatever. We're trying to do good for the player, and there's no separation between reality and virtuality, because you are experiencing it, and even though you know it is not true, it is forming you as a person. And I know that might be somewhat controversial to say, but if you don't make challenge in your game, or if you give out a cookie because this person's failed 10 times, you're making that person unable to tackle real life. And that is one of the core elements of MMO addiction, and why people retreat into these worlds, because this MMO will always acknowledge their attempts, their efforts, and won't, won't be harsh on them. And I, as I say, I know that is a tough one. And what I would say is, instead, stop setting unrealistic goals for the player. Stop setting these pie-in-the-sky things. Instead, acknowledge the achievements they do make. Acknowledge the score they achieved, that they stayed alive that little bit longer. Or even if it wasn't as long as they did yesterday, say, well, you've done that, Give them that sense there. And if you don't have progression in your core game loop, if you truly acknowledge the skill of the player, even a mediocre playthrough, even something that doesn't rate against 50% of the player base, is still valid, because it's something they have achieved within the system. It's not something someone gave to them. And the problem you're talking about will almost go away if you give the player that honesty of experience. And as I say, it is a complicated one, so it's something you might want to talk about more, but anyway. Right, here we go. So, top of the class, I just want to praise Spelunky. There are a lot of other games that are very, very good. I wanted to potentially give this to Starcraft 2, but the multiplayer has an element in its laddering that has a mild addiction component, if you've ever done it. It's very, very mild. It's a great game overall, and I highly recommend that. And that's true of every game I'm speaking about here. I highly recommend all of these games. But StarCraft 2's laddering kind of gave it a slight taint, so I really wanted to speak about Spelunky. So Spelunky, it's pure self-contained joy. Unlike a narrative game, it doesn't expect most players to see the end. In fact, the bulk of the content is hidden behind secrets and immense skill challenges, but all the core mechanics are exposed from the get-go. There's very few elements of play you don't see until later. There are some, but they're very, very few. I would be surprised if the bulk of the player base has only glimpsed the jungle level, the second zone, because it's a hard game. It's a very hard game. But it provides an interesting and self-contained escalation of threat. So it uses a bit of progression and it uses a bit of escalation, but very contained into the zone progression and mechanics such as the ghost arriving or shopkeeper aggro. And most sessions are under 5 minutes. A full clear of the game is about 30 minutes, though it's doable in under 5 minutes. The world record is something like 2 minutes 30. And so Spelunky is a game of challenge. With every new player, it's fresh, but it's very familiar. Experienced players are as familiar with the monster patterns as they are with the level generation sequences that are thrown at them. And the skill level is immensely deep. From the very basic, to which you just treat it like a platformer, to understanding the systems being thrown at you, realizing what to expect, and second guessing all that. And it's a lot of people have spoken about how deep it is. And despite playing the original freeware version on PC, the XBLA version and the PC version, on the XBLA version and the PC version, I still haven't defeated the boss, let alone the secret hell boss. But it's an almost daily ritual for me to log in and do the challenge, and that's something I really enjoyed. And I started wondering, is this addiction in disguise? Is this another kind of addiction? And so I stepped away from it, and I didn't feel a yearning to play for it. It was more like having a morning run as part of your routine. It's something you enjoy, it's something that invigorates you mentally instead of physically. But it's not something that has a dependency there for you. You just really enjoy it. And after thousands of deaths, it still treats me the same as the first attempt. It's always harsh, but it's fair. And even if I die on the 3rd level or whatever, I know I died because I made a mistake. And if I get, far in a play, I know, well, I've done really well. So I'd say this is a great example of why progression is bad, and why if you design a game, and I say progression is bad for free play games, it's just post-affix narrative, but if you design a game that is capable of existing without it, the hours of playtime can just be demonstrated if you look up the Steam stats for Spelunky. People have played ridiculous amount of hours, and it's still got a very vibrant community very long after its release. So the trigger for writing this article is desktop dungeons. And I was hesitant to talk about this because I'm going to say up front now, go out and buy Desktop Dungeons. It's a small indie game and it's marvelous. It's really, really marvelous. However, it is, the reason I'm going to talk about it is because not only is it the trigger for this article, but it's also the perfect case study of this addiction to progression and how it can taint your core game loop. So this set aside, I want to highly recommend it. It's an indie game. Every sale matters to the developer, so please, do support it. And I strongly recommend any game designer to at least look at the freeware version, and for comparison to play the full revamped version. Now, it was after about 80 hours with the new version of the game that I realized I'd started hating it. I instantly recognized the symptoms of drug addiction. I instantly recognized that boost that you get, and then that dependency. I hesitate so much to say that because it's a really good game and you should play it. But it is the perfect case study, because when Desktop Dungeons first came out as a freeware game, it was a self-contained loop. You unlocked new classes and such, but that unlocking was quite easy, and that was the only hint of progression. That was it, and every single play session was about under 15 minutes typically, and it was always fresh, and you kept on coming back to it, and it was a very easy game to load up when you had a few minutes to kill, and it was very enjoyable. And QFC, Quarter Circle Forward, I believe they're called, did a wonderful revamp and reskin, and they rebuilt the game from the ground up, adding a lot of polish. And in the process, they added a central town, which you, in the campaign, basically level up, you unlock buildings, you do more challenges, you maintain a kingdom gold supply, you maintain a kingdom inventory, and frankly, it basically just injected this massive progression component and this drug habit. All of a sudden, Desktop Dungeons developed a drug habit. It's really funny to see, but it's the best example if you compare it. There is still the random adventure in there, which is a hat tip to the original and similar, but it's no longer pure, and you can't actually enjoy it as much because the balance is all out of whack. And the balance is built with this concept of escalation, with this idea of easy, medium, and hard levels, and very hard, and this idea that this class combination needs all of these items, and you can go in there, and every dungeon has these little badges that get stamped out and unlocked and such, and it just reeks of that progression layered on. It's not part of the core game loop. It feels external, and as I say, I've put in over 8 hours into the game, the new version, and there's no end in sight. And I had to stop playing because I realized I was beginning to hate the game. I was beginning to realize that despite my love for the original, and despite all of those core elements there was an unhealthy aspect that I was constantly playing the game and almost zoning out in order to unlock this one quest that wasn't unlocking all this one element. And you were no longer playing because it was fun. You were playing because you were just trying to get through it. And a good example of this is if you find yourself listening to audiobooks or watching movies and stuff a lot while playing a game, and you find yourself losing time to the game and not thinking, oh, well, what did I do? It's a good example of if the game's got a progression addiction, so to speak. So the original addict, Dungeons and Dragons. This is probably the strongest single influence on modern game industry and digital games, but while it wasn't totally unique in the concepts of leveling and loot, it pretty much affirmed the current structure that modern gaming follows by and large. And I've run many a campaign, I've written convention modules, I've run games at conventions, I've worked with people on role-playing systems and such, and run into the various different flavors of role-playing, and all the versions of the old dragon. And a conclusion I reached a very long time ago, and it's a conclusion many other GMs I know have reached, is that the leveling system is inherently broken. The level to which they have this agreement varies and differs, and GMs will generally disagree about the sweet spot and stuff, but a lot of people say, oh, it's really fun when the players are like level 5 or level 8 or 12 or whatever, and I really like that, but I find the game gets silly after they're at this level, or I really hate the players rolling up first level characters because they're so underpowered. And the system and the world and the game loop just can't combine these two extremes of this weak, feeble character that has very few verbs and very few powers that they can use, to this overpowered character that the game can barely contain. And you all have all sorts of problems like Monty Hall and loot override. It's the classic example of this progression addiction, and I've seen a lot of GMs and role-playing people talk about these problems. And we have come up in the role-playing world with some solutions. First thing I would say is, despite that awesome juice of progression, despite how good progression feels, the true power of D&D and role-playing in general, when you speak to players, is they will be describing that one epic moment or that amazing story where the game expressed either a true test of skill that they overcame, something they really kicked ass on, or this wonderful, brilliant, contained narrative that was woven between the players and the GM and its wonderful story. It's those things that shine through, those things that give the moments of majesty to role-playing. And I'd say both of these are now expressed at conventions through these self-contained modules. Role-playing conventions, we tend to run modules for about 4 to 5 hours or whatever, and whenever you run a module, there's no acknowledgement of previous play. It's a self-contained loop. It's often a fixed narrative with pre-constructed characters that you go through, or the characters are generated on some kind of fixed point quotient or level that the story demands them to be. And as I say, it can be these wonderful fixed narratives that are just a wonderful little story to tell, or a little potential story to tell, or they can be these really tough dungeons that test game knowledge, and that's when the figurines come out and people start going, okay, well, I'm going to move one square here and I'm going to do this and la la la, and people get really into that, and it's as I say, it's a test of skill. So it expresses both elements really well, without this addiction to progression, and it escapes that. And there's many role-playing systems that have eschewed progression or have rethought progression. I would welcome you to, I'd invite you to look at Fate. It's a system that's been around for a while, and recently a Kickstarter did a whole revamp on it, and you can find most details online, but they really reworked how characters were expressed, how stats worked, and how progression worked. And there's a lot of other role-playing systems that have explored either no progression in their systems, or very limited progression, or swap out progression, where when you progress, it's more about your character changing and your character becoming more powerful, so like swapping in one skill for another, things like that. Oh, that's a mouthful that I've gone through there. I highly encourage digital game designers to look at the problems GMs express about long-term campaigns and how convention modules address this, because I think to a large extent the role-playing community has solved this problem, even if it's not widely distributed. but it's something we can bring across and get a lot of lessons. So a classic addict I want to talk about that I think could just be such a better game is Tony Hawk Pro Skater, a game series I've spent many an hour on. Again, fabulous game, highly recommended if you haven't played. There's a HD remake of Tony Hawk that is on Steam and XBLA and stuff. Highly recommend it. Go get it. But Tony Hawk has this core mechanic around skater progression. All the skaters start out really kind of terrible. There's a bunch of balance stats and how much air time they can get, and all the numbers are scaled right down. And there's variation in the starting stats of skaters, but they're pretty much all sucky. Through the progress of the game, the career mode, they basically get powered up until you pretty much max every stat out. And at that point, every skate is the same because they're fully maxed out, and the level design just breaks down, because the level design, you know, of most levels has to be built thinking, oh, what if they're not that great in airtime, but what if they're maxed out on airtime and I've got to do all that? And the skater progression system self-sabotages the core game loop, basically taking a system that could be really well balanced and really well thought out. Again, to reference back to Desktop Dungeon's freeware version, where everything was balanced for specific, you know, setups and whatnot. And then it has to sacrifice that because it has to cater for a wider skill deviance, you know, between really shitty characters and really overpowered characters. And that self-restricts the depth of gameplay, because players don't have to get better. They can just wait for the game to make them better so they can overcome challenges. And again, this is because the developers don't want to lock content away. They want to make it easier for people to get through content. But again, I would say if you're selling the content, just make the content available, and, you know, give the players a variety of skaters, because you're self-restricting the depth. The players don't necessarily have to develop that much depth. And while there is a competitive element in Tony Hawk, it is restricted to the top 1%, where they're using a maxed out skater and they know every jump and thing, and they really do this awesome thing, and so it's restricted to that top slice of the leaderboard. Whereas if you didn't have skater progression and all the skaters provided a bit of variation, but it was with a much tighter clamp, then all of a sudden, even if you haven't finished the campaign, or you know, are fully finished with the campaign, you can compete against your friends and you can talk in a similar space. You know, you're not talking the difference between scores of 10,000 and scores of 10 million. You're talking the difference between, oh, I managed a 50,000 run, or I managed a 100,000 run, or whatever. And all of a sudden that scales right down, and it just makes the community more cohesive. It allows that deeper slice of skill. The entire level can be built with this knowledge in mind. And you know, I think it's an example of a classic game genre series, which is mostly dead now. But you know, think, just a design thought experiment, how much different that game could be if it didn't have that skater progression in it, and it relied on skill progression to get all those things, to do all those challenges. And then all of a sudden every challenge, even the easy ones, means something because you have actually achieved that. Another topic, MMOs and Skyrim. Okay, I put this in as basically a nod to something I'm not acknowledging. It could be a whole nother article. I point somewhat to the talk that we had about Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing, but these epic RPGs and these MMOs and how that handles progression is a very big topic, and let's talk about it in the comments. But I think it could be a whole nother article. It's quite a tricky problem to unpick, though I would say convention modules perhaps provide some inspiration there. The exception that proves the rule, XCOM. So this sounds like it breaks everything, but XCOM, and I'm talking mostly about the new XCOM, but all of these rules apply to the original classic, is really something that proves out what we're talking about. As the exception. So first of all, the campaign, you're likely to fail the campaign the first time you try. Failure is designed into the system, and that means your first campaign is probably only going to be a few hours long. A single campaign averages around 20 hours. That's kind of hard to judge, but I'd say around 20 hours. I've recorded some campaigns for YouTube, and I've seen some other playlists recorded, so I know those numbers are roughly right. No previous campaigns are acknowledged when you start a new campaign. There's a second wave option that can unlock some new things if you've unlocked some challenges, but it's really a flavor thing. And ultimately, when you start a campaign, you're starting a campaign fresh, and every campaign is a self-contained loop designed for multiple plays. Again, if you look at the Steam stats for this game, the playtime is off the charts. It really is for that. And while there is an escalation contained in the story, and there is progression contained in the story of that gameplay loop, progression can be lost. The entire campaign can be lost with a single bad decision. Usually you can recover from a single bad decision, but it's a very harsh game, and it is that inability to compromise, that honesty in its systems, its systematic game design, that make it a free play game, even though it's delivering a fixed narrative in the campaign. People are still playing XCOM 2-3 years after its release, whatever it is, round about there, and they're on their 50th, 60th campaign or whatever, and they're still, playing it because they're treating it like Spelunky or chess or Carcassonne or whatever. It's a strong core game loop. It's balanced with a very tight set of parameters in mind. You know that it takes a certain amount of time to get to plasma weapons, and you know that the player's not going to hang around because the aliens will just get harder and harder on them, and so that progression and escalation in the core game loop is a self-feedback system used to push the player to succeed or fail. So it's all in there, and I would say that the systematic design here really proves what you can do if you quit progression. If you're willing to get off that drug and you're willing to use it as a very limited tool and not as a masking method for your design, I think you will find it a lot better. If you can get rid of those tick boxes, then you'll find the players a lot more entertained. So, conclusion. I haven't spoken about many AAA games because I'd say 99% of modern AAA games suffer from this addiction really badly, with checkboxes and such. And I would say stop using progression and escalation as a crutch to extend gameplay. Use it as a limited resource. Use it as an editorial system. Respect the player. Everything discussed here has obviously been made artificially black and white, and it's more here as a guideline, and things are much more complex and multifaceted. And to that end, I welcome you down there in the comments to chat away. I will be responding to all the ones on YouTube and on AltDev, and hopefully we can have a constructive discussion on this talk, and I hope it's helped you out in some small way, and that this has made it a bit easier to digest. I know I talked about some stuff here that's not in the article. I was just worried because this article was getting really long. Anyway, ciao.